The spotlight was burning hot against Elvis's face when he first saw her. It was March 15th, 1975, at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, 2 shows into what was supposed to be a routine 3-week residency. The burgundy curtains hung heavy in the smoky air, and the crowd of 2,500 was settling into the familiar rhythm of a Vegas Elvis show. Cocktail waitresses weaving between tables, the clink of ice against crystal, the expectant energy of tourists ready to witness the king. Elvis was halfway through Can't Help Falling in Love when something in the third row caught his attention. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, was singing along with every word, but not in the casual way most fans did. Her lips moved with precision, forming each phrase a split second before he sang it, as if she was leading rather than following. Her eyes were closed, but not in the dreamy, transported way of someone lost in the music. These eyes stayed closed because they had to. She was blind, and she knew his music better than he did. Elvis had performed this song thousands of times, in recording studios, on television stages, in concert halls across the world. But tonight, hearing her voice rise from the audience like smoke through amber light, something fundamental shifted inside his chest. Her voice was completely untrained, rough around the edges where professional coaching would have smoothed it, but it carried a depth of feeling that made his own polished delivery seem suddenly hollow. She wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't trying to impress or be heard. She was just living inside the music, the way people did when they thought no one was listening. The Vegas crowd was its usual mix: high-rolling tourists from Los Angeles, regulars who came to every show, local business people entertaining clients. Drinks clinked against tables. Quiet conversations hummed beneath the music. Cigarette smoke created ghostly layers in the colored lights. It was the familiar controlled chaos of a Vegas showroom. People who came to see Elvis Presley, the product, the spectacle, the safe rebellion of their youth, packaged for middle-aged consumption. But this girl sat perfectly still in the middle of all the manufactured energy. Her hands were folded in her lap like she was in church. Her face was tilted slightly upward, not toward the stage, but toward something higher, as if she could see the music floating somewhere above the lights and mirrors. Elvis missed a line, actually forgot the words to his own song. James Burton, his guitarist, caught his eye with a questioning look, and the backup singers covered the moment with extended harmonies. But Elvis barely noticed. He was transfixed, watching her lips move, forming words he'd written decades ago in a different lifetime. Words that seemed to hold more meaning coming from her than they had ever held coming from him. When the song ended and the applause began its familiar wave across the showroom, Elvis did something he'd never done in 15 years of Vegas performances. Instead of launching into his next number, instead of riding the momentum that kept these shows moving like well-oiled machines, he set his microphone in its stand and walked to the edge of the stage. The crowd sensed something different immediately. The applause faded to confusion, then to expectant silence. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying without amplification to where she sat. The acoustic design of the showroom meant every word reached the back wall clearly. "You in the third row, in the blue dress?" 2,500 heads turned to follow his gaze. The girl's head tilted, a small movement that spoke of years of navigating the world through sound alone. "Yes, you, honey, the young lady who was singing with me just now, making me sound better than I deserved." A spotlight operator, following Elvis's line of sight, swung one of the pin spots to illuminate her section. She was smaller than she'd seemed from the stage, wearing a simple blue dress that looked carefully homemade, the kind of garment that spoke of skilled hands working with limited resources. Her dark hair was pulled back in a modest bun, secured with what looked like a rubber band rather than proper pins. When the bright light hit her directly, she didn't squint or shield her face like sighted people did. She just sat very still, like a deer that had suddenly found itself in an open field. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sarah," she said, and though her voice was quiet, the showroom's acoustics carried it clearly to every corner. "Sarah Mitchell." "Sarah Mitchell, that's a pretty name. Tell me, Sarah, how long have you been listening to my music?" She hesitated, and Elvis could see her hands tighten slightly in her lap. "Since I was 7 years old, Mr. Presley. My daddy played your records every night before bed, said music was the best medicine for whatever ailed you." Elvis felt something familiar and painful stir in his chest. The recognition of loss, of a child who'd learned too young that the people you love don't always stay. Your daddy has excellent taste in music, I'll give him that. Is he here with you tonight? The silence that followed was different from the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for entertainment. This was the silence of grief, of words that couldn't be spoken easily, of a young woman trying to find her voice to share something that still hurt to say aloud. No, sir. He passed 2 years ago. Car accident on Highway 61, coming home from his shift at the cotton mill. Elvis stood there for a moment, 5 feet from the edge of the stage, looking down at this girl who had just shared her deepest loss with 2,500 strangers because he'd asked a simple question. The audience was completely quiet now, sensing they were witnessing something unscripted, something real in a city built on beautiful illusions. I'm sorry for your loss, honey. Truly sorry. Thank you, Mr. Presley. He left me his record collection when he passed. Mostly your songs, played so many times the grooves were wearing thin. I know them all by heart now. Every word, every harmony, every little breath you take between phrases. All of them? Yes, sir. Even the ones that weren't on the radio. I'm left, you're right, she's gone. Mystery Train. Milk Cow Blues Boogie. All of them. I've got them memorized like some people memorize prayers. Elvis looked back at his band. James Burton on guitar, Ronnie Tutt behind the drums, Jerry Sheff on bass, all of them professionals who knew how to keep a show moving, how to maintain the energy that Vegas audiences expected. Then he glanced toward the wings where his manager stood, making frantic gestures to keep things on schedule, to remember they had another show at midnight and couldn't afford to lose momentum. But Elvis had stopped caring about momentum the moment he heard Sarah's voice weaving through his own, like silver thread through cloth. Sarah, would you mind coming up here with me? The request sent a murmur through the crowd. This wasn't how Vegas shows worked. Elvis Presley didn't invite random audience members on stage, especially not in the middle of a carefully choreographed performance. I don't know if I can, Sarah said, her voice smaller now. Why's that, honey? I've never been on a stage before, and I can't. You can't see? No, sir. Elvis was already moving, stepping down from the stage into the audience. His security detail tensed, but he waved them off. He walked directly to Sarah's row, and the people sitting between her and the aisle immediately stood to let him pass. When he reached her, he could see she was trembling slightly. Up close, he noticed things the spotlight had missed. Her dress was faded, but carefully pressed. Her shoes were old, but polished. Everything about her spoke of poverty faced with dignity. May I? He asked, extending his hand. She hesitated for just a moment, then placed her hand in his. It was small and rough, the hand of someone who worked. Elvis helped her stand and guided her toward the stage. The audience watched in complete silence as he led her up the steps, one careful step at a time. Don't worry about not being able to see, he said softly, just for her. The music doesn't need eyes. On stage, under the full intensity of the lights, Sarah looked even younger and more vulnerable. But when Elvis handed her a microphone, something changed in her posture. What would you like to sing with me, Sarah? Could we do Love Me Tender? That was Daddy's favorite. Elvis nodded to his piano player, who began the familiar opening chords. But instead of standing at his usual position, center stage, Elvis moved to stand beside Sarah, close enough that she could feel his presence. When she began to sing, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Her voice was nothing like what they expected from someone who'd never performed before. It was clear and strong, but more than that, it was honest in a way that professional singers spent years trying to recapture. She sang like someone who had lived inside these songs, who had found comfort in them during the darkest nights of grief. Elvis found himself harmonizing almost instinctively, his voice weaving around hers instead of leading it. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing. He was just singing, the way he used to in his mother's kitchen before fame complicated everything. When they reached the chorus, Sarah's voice broke slightly on the word tender, and Elvis could hear 20 years of loneliness, 20 years of missing someone who would never come home, in that single moment of imperfection. It was the most beautiful, truly heartbreaking sound he'd ever heard on his stage, more genuine than any note that he'd ever sung. The song ended, but neither of them moved to leave the microphones. The audience was completely silent, and Elvis realized that some people were crying. Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. That was perfect. Thank you for letting me sing with you. Daddy would have been so happy. Elvis looked out at the audience, then back at Sarah, seeing something in her face that reminded him of himself at 19. That mixture of hope and fear, of knowing you had something special, but not knowing if the world would ever give you a chance to share it. You know what? I think he was here tonight. I think he heard every word. Sarah smiled then, the first real smile since she'd stepped on stage, and Elvis made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the crowd, I want you to remember this young woman's name, Sarah Mitchell, because you're going to be hearing a lot more from her. He turned back to Sarah. Honey, how would you feel about recording some music? Real music in a real studio? I couldn't afford something like that. You won't have to. It would be my honor. What happened next became part of Vegas legend. Elvis spent the next hour sharing his stage with Sarah Mitchell, teaching her harmonies, telling stories about the songs they sang together. The audience, expecting a typical Elvis show, instead witnessed something much rarer. The moment when music strips away everything artificial and becomes what it was always meant to be, a bridge between human souls. 6 months later, Sarah's first album, produced by Elvis himself, reached number 12 on the country charts. But more important than any commercial success was what happened that night in Vegas. The moment when a grieving young woman found her voice and Elvis Presley remembered why he'd started singing in the first place. Years later, when asked about the most meaningful moment of his career, Elvis never mentioned the movies or the gold records or the sold-out shows around the world. He talked about a blind girl in the third row who knew every word to every song and how her voice reminded him that the best music always comes from the heart. He kept a photo from that night on his dressing room mirror until the day he died. Sarah standing beside him on stage, her face lifted toward lights she couldn't see, singing like she was born to do it.